here in Eastern Kentucky.
Oh man, it's been lovely here in Seattle. Come on over. All right, guys. Well, I just hit record. Thanks for joining. We are going to go ahead and get started. I think it's the CEO show today. So I'm going to get us started and then I'll pass it off to our TA expert. So if you are here to learn all about SNAP E&T and organizational capacity, you're in the right space. But if not, I encourage you all to stay. And I'd like to introduce our lovely TA partner, Erin, with CEO. Take it away, Erin.
Hi, everybody. So nice to see all of you today, and I'm very excited to speak to you about capacity. Um, it is, can be a little bit of a daunting topic sometimes. When you're starting to think about big picture of what does it take to run a SNAP E&T program, and so this is, really the session if you're wanting to understand like what kind of infrastructure do I need to have in place, what kind of people do I need to have in place, what kind of technology, things like that you want to be considering when you're getting ready to implement a SNAP E&T program and trying to integrate, what is required of SNAP E&T into your existing program. So much of it is not about like trying to reinvent the wheel, but what can we use that we already have and make small little tweaks to it that'll make it, SNAP E&T compliant so you can run an effective program. So today we're going to talk about, just a few things, but real quick recap on, where we left things off on our screening and eligibility referrals. Just want to get some feedback to figure out, how y'all are feeling about that last session. How's your technical assistance going? And do you have a good understanding of that? And, really just going to get a temperature check on that. Our topics we're going to talk about, again, all things capacity related. How do you assess your capacity to run a SNAP E&T program? What are the non-personnel infrastructure capacity needs that you might need to be considering? Do you have a facility that you're going to hold trainings at? Do you have the technology requirements and case management? Some things can be done very, very low tech. Some things maybe you need to have more high tech. And it really depends on, your size and scale and how many participants you're going to serve and what your resources are. And those vary from organization to organization greatly. So, we're going to talk a little bit about that, how you assess that. And then the personnel piece, which is really the big piece of that, because even with all the technology and facilities, without the people to do the work, you don't have a program. And so we're going to talk about how do you take SNAP E&T functions and map that to your existing roles, and then identify whether or not you have any gaps with that. And if there are gaps, we want to figure out like, how do I address those gaps? What are the solutions? It's not necessarily that you need to hire somebody else. It might just mean that you need to be doing a little bit of training, or you need to shift some responsibilities around. There's lots of options that you can explore for, making sure that you have the staff capacity to run a SNAP E&T program. We're going to go over a cool little tool that SJI has developed for the SNAP mapping. This is going to be included in the presentation. It's going to be on the landing page, and then if you can go through that mapping tool and go over with your technical assistance teams to see where you are with that, that would be great. But it's a nice little tool that goes over the various functions of SNAP E&T, so that you can start thinking about what personnel staff that you want to assign to those functions. So you can start thinking about that. And then we'll give you just some examples of how those tools, various roles within programs might align with some of those functions. And then we'll just recap on where we're going to go from there in the next sessions. So before we get started, I just want to find out if there are any questions, anything anybody wanted to ask before we get going. But otherwise, we're ready to rock and roll. Okay. most of you have been through these before, but we just ask that you make the most of this time. You be present, you listen, you try to learn. Make sure that you mute yourself so that we're not getting any kind of unnecessary feedback. Throughout the session, please use the chat, ask questions. We want this to be engaging. We want you have a question, most likely somebody else in the room has that same question. So we just need you to be a little bit brave. Bring that question forward. Love to be able to try to address those for the group so everybody can learn. Make sure you take that time. If you need to get up and stretch or step away for a second, please feel free to do that. Know that this session is recorded. You'll have access to it on the landing page. So, all is good there. And just ready to go and excited to talk about capacity. All right, so real quick recap. Our last session was on eligibility, screening, and referrals. So really just want to do a quick vote of the room and understand, how do you feel about what you've learned? Do you feel like you have a solid understanding of the participant eligibility, the screening and referral process? And go ahead and, if you could, go into the chat. And I want you to say that if you feel like you nailed it, you have a good understanding of it, and I want you to say a win for that. If you feel like you don't quite have an understanding, that you still want some additional clarification, maybe it's the eligibility piece of understanding who's eligible, or maybe it's understanding, how somebody becomes eligible for SNAP E&T, or where they might not be if they have SNAP benefits. Do you have a good understanding of your referral process? Do you know if you were to start a program, where are your participants going to be coming from? Do you have a good pipeline of SNAP E&T eligible participants? So if you feel like you have a great understanding of that, gap if you think you need some little clarification. If you think you're rocking and ready to go and you know exactly what you're going to do and you're ready to go on day one when you have a program up and running, type in there, let's go. So I'd like to see that in the chat real quick and see where you feel like. Okay, Barbara, I see you guys have a good understanding. Eastern Action, so win, good. Nice. So as a follow-up to that, I'm just curious, if anybody had a looming question that they just haven't had answered yet and they're curious about, if you want to either come off mute or put something in the chat, please feel free to do so. All right, you guys are ready to just get right into it, and I appreciate that. All right. Good understanding, but won't be eligible to add recruit for at least 12 months out. Gotcha, Scott. So the great thing about that is, you have plenty of time to continue to develop that referral pipeline and make sure that you have it ready to go when you are all set. So, okay, Robert, perfect. Well, obviously, as always, if you do have questions that come up, if you're working through that process and you'd like to get some clarification, please make sure you reach out to your TA team. That's what we're here for. More than happy to provide you resources or give you some examples of how other organizations are doing these things, and to make sure that you're set up for success when you are ready to go. So, all right. So, all right, capacity. So we can go ahead and jump to the next slide on that one. And it's going to be a recap of this wheel that you have seen a few times already. But, talking about what are the 4 things that you need to have an effective and strong SNAP E&T program. The providers that have a strong program, they're going to have alignment in all of these 4 sections. And, do you have the right participants? Meaning, going back to that eligibility and referral piece, you have SNAP E&T participants? Do you have the funding structure that you need for it? Non-federal funds is a big part of that. Do you have the service offerings that SNAP E&T is looking for? And are you able to offer those components? But today, we're going to talk about capacity. And so this is your ability to run an effective SNAP E&T program with the resources that you have internally with your existing program. And if you don't have some of those resources or you haven't fully fleshed those out yet, this is going to help you explore those things, and so you can begin start thinking about how to address them. So capacity refers to an organization's ability to effectively carry out the programmatic, administrative, fiscal, documentation, reporting, and compliant functions required to operate SNAP E&T programs. And, that sounds like a lot. And, to be quite honest, sometimes when you're dealing with things like a federal grant, SNAP E&T, it can seem a little bit daunting at first. But I can tell you that in most cases, everything can be broken down in pretty simplistic terms. States are really good about providing resources to, document how these processes are supposed to work. And, once you actually get a good understanding of the flow of SNAP E&T and how it's supposed to operate, a lot of it is really kind of natural and it makes sense. So it's, while it sounds like a lot, and it can be a little overwhelming at first, I just want you to know that, it, at time you start picking away with it, you start learning a little bit more, and you're like, all of a sudden a light bulb goes off and you're going to be like, this is easy. Looking forward to talking about those things. Okay, so just, to remind you, a lot of you already have programs that are up and running. And so really it's about not reinventing the wheel and having to, bring in a whole brand new program from scratch. It's about what do we take that we already have, what do we can modify to be compliant with SNAP E&T. So, it's not about starting a new program or serving a different type of participant. We're going to continue to ask that you're doing the same thing that you've always been doing. Now, some of you don't have those programs completely up and running yet, or you're still developing them. So that's also puts you in a great position to where you can start to think about, well, how do I, integrate these things into SNAP E&T. But again, it's not about reinventing the wheel. It's about taking what you already have and trying to leverage it. And there's two pieces that we're going to focus on. One is that non-personnel infrastructure capacity. So we're going to review the various non-personnel infrastructure considerations that you need to have to assist you in ensuring that you as a provider have the capacity to operate an effective SNAP E&T program. And then another big part of that, like I said, is going to be that personnel piece. So do you have the people that you need and the knowledge that is necessary to perform the functions of SNAP E&T and to run an employment and training program? Go one more on that one, thanks. So the big question is, like a lot of people ask, so what exactly does it take to run a SNAP E&T program? And so there's a lot of components to it. Your program entry, how are you going to get participants into the door? How are you screening them for benefits and eligibility? Performing that orientation to your program and doing an intake and assessment to make sure that they're a good fit for your program and that they're a good fit for SNAP E&T. Doing that eligibility verification. Then there's the service delivery, actually performing case management and the actual employment and training components. Coordinating any kind of participant reimbursement and providing those supportive services to those participants. There's the data collection. And, this is something that's near and dear to me because it kind of goes back to a lot of my background is, data tells the story, and FNS loves to get good data. States love to get good data on your program and to be able to really celebrate, because you are partnering with the state and the state wants to be able to celebrate having a great SNAP E&T program. So data is so important for them to understand, how many participants are you serving? How many people completed successfully? Of those who completed successfully, how many of those gained employment and what kind of wages were they gaining when they gained this employment? What is measuring the success of your program? So being able to capture that data and be able to report out on it is so critically important. Because again, the data tells the story about the program, and it allows us all to celebrate the success of SNAP E&T when it works. Budgeting and fiscal, It takes money to run a program. You got to keep the books maintained. You got to be able to have a strong fiscal compliance to make sure that you are adhering to, the cost matching principles, and that you're allocating cost effectively against SNAP E&T, and that you have good processes in place for that. And then, of course, just the program oversight. Who's going to be managing the contract negotiations with the state? Who's going to be monitoring your program to make sure that you're running an effective program, and are you going to have any kind of quality checks and change management processes in place? Are you going to have a corrective action process in place for if you find out that you're deficient in a certain area? And who's going to be the one who's going to be the liaison when you're running the program? Who's going to be that person to bridge the gap between you as the program provider and the state? And so these are things that you want to consider when you're going to be running a SNAP E&T program. So big piece of that is going to be policies and the procedures and the technology that's going to be needed to run a SNAP E&T program. The policy and procedures, that part, it takes a little bit of time to maybe document your own internal policies and procedures, and these are going to be things that are going to evolve over time. These aren't something that you have to have necessarily on day one, other than you need to have a good understanding of what's required and what you need to do and how you're going to execute. One of the things that we've done at CEO when it comes to policies and procedures is that it's a constantly evolving and improving document for us. So we're constantly, as we've scaled our operations and we've become bigger and bigger, it's become more and more important for us to make sure that we have a consistently high quality program. And so those are things that we have in place to make sure that we have a documented procedure for how do we intake a participant into our program? How do we do a benefit verification check? What do we do when a participant starts to kind of like deviate from the program model, and how do we get them back on track? And all of those kinds of things, we have documented processes and assigned to roles and responsibilities. And then when we find out that things aren't working correctly, how do we go about correcting those things? So again, not things that you need to have necessarily on day one, but definitely good best practices that you want to have to consider on running an effective program, not just for SNAP E&T really, but for any program. The technology piece is, you can be very, very low tech when you're running a SNAP E&T program. There's a lot of people who do it based off of just spreadsheets, and that works just fine for them because they're only serving maybe 20 participants or 25 participants. We have some organizations that serve 300 participants plus per year, and their technology requirements to be able to manage something like that be much greater. So they might have an actual case management system in place, document storage, electronic scanning, physical file structures, things like that. How do you maintain access to those documents if you have this really complex system? And you're dealing sometimes with PII information. Sometimes you are capturing HIPAA information. So like you have methods to kind of through your technology to keep that stuff separately. And just again, going back to the data, the reporting, and being able to export all of that data and be able to report it out to the state, because guess what? The state, as your E&T partner, they're going to want to have that information so that they can, again, they have to report out to FNS, to the national level, and so they want to be able to capture all that information from you as a provider so they can pass it on. And also just record management. How are you maintaining case file records, your participant tracking files, all that stuff? Do you have good systems in place? So the 6 infrastructure areas that you want to be looking at is like, how are you going to be doing your participant tracking? What's that intake, referral, participation in the program, and how do you document exits? And how, what system are you going to use to kind of track that information? What's that documentation infrastructure going to look like for where you're going to maintain case notes, the files, attendance, and your supports? Your fiscal piece, how are you managing your cost capture and your expenses and doing your budgeting? And this is going to be another session that we're going to have later on, that those fiscal components. But part of SNAP E&T is that you'll need to prepare a SNAP E&T budget. Which is no different than you preparing a budget for any other program, really. But you also want to be able to make sure that you have those fiscal infrastructure in place to track your costs, and so in a place where your backup is going to reside, so that when the whole purpose of this is that we need to get paid, right, for the work that we're doing. So you want to make sure you have good fiscal infrastructure in place to capture a lot of that. The data reporting piece, again, we talked about policies and procedures, and the technology record. So all of those things are going to be critical pieces that you want to be assessing when you're looking at running a SNAP E&T program. So going into that participant tracking and documentation, this kind of follows that participant journey of coming from how a participant comes into your program all the way to the exit. So you have that reverse referral, you do the intake, you do that eligibility check, you enroll them into your component. They're going to actually then work in that component and hopefully complete, and then they're going to gain employment, and you're going to have that as a successful completion and outcome. And so you want to make sure you have good infrastructure in place to capture those case comments, the progress that the participants making through the program, and be able to document what the next steps are for them to continue progressing through the program so that they have that successful completion. Part of SNAP E&T too is just being able to record the time that participant's spending in your program. They are performing activities, they're doing the training, they're going in through their certification, they're doing some studying, and you want to make sure you have a good way to be able to track what it is that they're doing so that you can report that attendance out through the SNAP E&T program. Part of SNAP E&T too is providing those supportive services to make sure that the participants are having any barriers that are coming up as it relates to them being able to participate to SNAP E&T, and being able to document that and have a good distribution method for how you're addressing those. And again, participant files, which we've talked about. So when you're talking about mapping some of these things, you kind of want to understand, like, where is this information residing in your program today? And is it going to meet the needs of the SNAP E&T program? And if not, then you just identify those gaps and you make those changes as necessary. But so that fiscal and data reporting part, it's such a critical piece, and you want to be able to know, like, are you able to capture all the costs that are eligible for you to be able to be billed to SNAP E&T? What we find a lot of times in providers, and this is an important piece, is that they are running an amazing program, but because they don't have strong fiscal controls in place to be able to capture all of the expenses that are eligible for SNAP E&T, you end up leaving money on the table, and you're not able to recoup the reimbursement that you could potentially be getting from SNAP E&T. So, making sure that you spend a fair amount of time understanding that piece of it, making sure you understand what all of your expenses are in your program, not just related to SNAP E&T, but overall, and then trying to make sure that you are understanding what of that is allowable to SNAP E&T, and then having an ongoing method to make sure that you're capturing that, so that when it comes to invoicing time, you're able to then invoice that out. And then also understanding, what kind of backup do you need to have in order to be able to get that invoice and for the state to be able to review it and pay it. And then, that being part of that is who's kind of checking all of that, who's making sure that they're collecting all of that and it's getting prepared, and sending that invoice out on a monthly or quarterly basis, whatever the state's asking for. The other piece, like I said, with the invoice, a lot of times is data reporting. And what we see a lot of times in states too, they're getting really more, they're getting better about being able to take the data that you as a provider are sending and aligning that up to that fiscal piece and understanding, like making sure that the data tells the story on the invoice, because your invoice tells that story too. It shows, the expenses that you have coming in and that you're spending on participants, and making sure like your participant reimbursements that you're providing to participants, is being reflected not only in the data that we're reporting to the state, but also in your invoice. And so making sure that you have that good tie between fiscal and the data piece to make sure that they tie, that really sets you up for success, to make sure that you have the minimum amount of issues or questions that the state might have with reviewing your invoice. And every state does things a little bit differently, and they have, some states are a lot more scrutinous, and others are pretty simple. But having good systems in place up front definitely helps to head off a lot of those problems, and to make sure that you have your documentation up front to ensure that you have a timely reimbursement of those expenses. So I can't stress that enough in a lot of cases. So policies, procedures, the technology, the records, like, this kind of might be a little bit of a broken record here, and it feels like we're saying the same things, but again, you just want to make sure that you have that infrastructure in place for a documentation of your policy and procedures, your technology, and your records management, and make sure that's all very well aligned. So when you're doing your assessment of your infrastructure, and this goes not only to all of these various components that we're talking about, but also to your staff mapping, you really need to look at each one of these individual areas and understand, where do you lie in that? How are you doing? Where do you need to make improvements, or do you think you're really well aligned on that? And so you'll do an assessment of these various functions, to understand, like, do you have good systems in place? Do you have good documentation in place? And are you ready to go already from day one? If you are, that's great. You probably are going to be in great standing to be able to show that you, as an E&T provider, have the capacity to run an E&T program. And that's, part of what the states are going to be looking for. It's not just that you have a great program, it's just that you have the capacity to meet the needs of SNAP E&T. So being able to do these assessments up front, and to have that understanding, that puts you in a great position, so when you actually do submit your application, that you can demonstrate that you have that capacity. Now, you might find that you're only partially ready on some of these areas, and there's some gray areas, and I would be very surprised if everybody from day one was able to go through and say, "Nope, we're ready to go, we're good." Even CEO, when we open up a new site, as an example, for someplace, there will be a state that has different requirements, different expectations, and we always go through this very same process to make sure that we are ready and good to go on all of these fronts on day one, because we want to, one, be able to demonstrate that we are a great partner and we know what we're doing as a SNAP E&T provider, and that we can partner with the states on that. But also, we want to have a high quality, service that we're offering to the participants that we're there to serve. So we do these very same assessments, even though that we do this, work in 12 different states across the country. If you do find it, you have a gap, then that's an opportunity. That's not a problem. It's not necessarily to say that it's going to stop you from being a SNAP E&T provider, but it is an opportunity for you to assess that gap and figure out how to plug that gap, and to bring yourself into that place where you're feeling great about being a provider. So now that we've talked about the infrastructure piece of it, the technology, like your facilities and the things that you're going to need, I just like to pause for a second and see if there were any questions or anything that's kind of standing out in your mind that you've heard so far that has caused you to think about this a little bit more. You have questions. And if so, if you could just drop it in the chat, we'd love to see what that might be. We're gonna get them one of these days, Samantha. I promise. Somebody's gonna be like, I get it.
Anyone? No wrong answers here. Safe space. Oh my gosh.
I was gonna actually just say,
This
Samantha, have your cat ask a question.
this is Indigo, my 17-year-old baby who I've had since I moved out as an adult, who cannot get enough SNAP E&T. He's always in my lap trying to mess with my keyboard and participate. Yes, his name is Indigo.
Barbara, if I could be so bold to put you on the spot for a moment, I'm just curious. So, from this and what you've seen so far, and knowing that you have a well established program in your state already, do you see any challenges thus far that would prevent you from being able to run an effective SNAP E&T, or do you have any gaps that are of immediate concern to you? Like, just
No,
shaking her head.
no, I'm
No.
excited. I want to get rolling.
Yeah. Okay.
We've just been
Are
blessed that
there?
most of this work is stuff we're already doing, even like capturing all that data. It's just that's the way our grant was set up. So it's just like, I don't know, it's just gonna fall
Let's
right in place.
go.
We lucked
Yeah.
out. Absolutely. This was just a blessing.
So
Awesome.
you've got the experience already under your belt, and now it's just like, oh, well, now you're going to leverage that experience that you already have to be able to tap into this as a funding source. And that's really what makes SNAP E&T so great, is because so many people don't even know about it, that it exists, and they're already doing the work. So it's, again, it's not about reinventing the wheel and having to put something new in place necessarily. Although we do have some potential providers in this cohort that they are building a program from scratch, so and that's great too. But the fact that you have that experience already under your belt does give you kind of a leg up in being able to kind of execute on this. So Scott asked, are there any platforms that provide assistance with all the data recording, reporting? It seems like there's a neat opportunity. So yeah, so there are programs out there, software providers that can provide you some of that infrastructure that you need. They go from very, very basic, depending on if you just need something from a case management system, to very, very elaborate systems that handle, the whole suite of everything that you need to do to run an employment and training program. As an example, CEO, we use a Salesforce platform, and that handles all of our case management system. However, for the fiscal piece of it, we use our grants accounting team uses a separate system. And interesting enough, we're actually in the process of going through a review process right now for overhauling all of that. Not necessarily, I think, our case management system, but mostly a grants management system, with that fiscal piece being a large component. The other thing that I would, and so Samantha is Caseworthy, Salesforce. So we have some experience working with the Caseworthy system. Actually, the state of Georgia's SNAP E&T system is based off of Caseworthy. And it's a great system to work with it as well. The nice thing is too, is some states, and I can't speak for West Virginia and Kentucky, what kind of infrastructure that they already have as a state provider, but some states actually have built their own SNAP E&T systems that you as a provider can access and basically utilize if you choose to do so, or well, a lot of times it is mandatory. They want you to utilize that system. And that can create its own unique challenges too, especially for a provider that has a large scale operation like CEO, because we have a system already. And then, so what that causes us to have to do, and it's not a huge challenge. We have a person who's able to do this, but we take that data that we have from our system and we transfer it into the state's system. And then we also work with the states, when they have these external systems that they'd like us to use, to see if, like, can we upload this data in some form, or can we provide it to you in an electronic format versus having to have somebody actually manually data enter that stuff. So long story short is, there are third-party providers out there that do this work, that can provide you with a case management system. There are states that also provide a system that they would like you to utilize, that might meet some of those needs, at least on the case management and data reporting side of it. And then finally, I'd like to kind of just briefly hit on intermediaries. So there are intermediaries out there that they have to be approved by the state, but they can serve as that infrastructure to smaller providers who do not necessarily have everything that they would need to run a SNAP E&T program, whether it's the fiscal piece, whether it's the compliance and oversight piece. And intermediaries serve an important role in, one, not only being able to provide some of that infrastructure, but two, providing the technical assistance on an ongoing basis with third-party providers to ensure that kind of help them along and making sure that they're running an effective programs. So that intermediary will serve kind of like as an in-between between the state and that third-party provider who needs them. As an example, CEO is an intermediary in Oklahoma for the state of Oklahoma, and we provide intermediary services for four third-party providers in Tulsa, and we provide everything from that technical assistance on referral processes and intake and orientations, and we even do some of the administrative legwork for the state on doing case file reviews and making sure that the providers are being compliant with the documentation requirements and things like that. So intermediaries can be an also really great tool to use to get you up and running in a SNAP E&T program if your state has intermediaries that can offer those services to you.
Great. Just one further question, just along the same lines. I'm just curious with interactions with states that have built their own programming versus the use of a Salesforce or something that's pretty much off the shelf. Which do you find more efficient? Fixing all the bugs that come along with the state program or just starting from scratch on your own?
I have so many thoughts about this.
I do too.
You first, Aaron.
Well, here's what I will say. I have not found a state system yet that really kind of checks all the boxes that I'd like to see. I have seen some really great ones. But all of them work differently in a way. One of my favorites is actually the one that Oklahoma is using right now. And the provider's name who's developing this with the state is escaping me. But it is specifically tailored for SNAP E&T, and the flow makes sense, but it still doesn't have really all the functionality that it needs as a third-party provider. It currently is focused more on the data piece and basically just getting the participants into the system, tracking their hours, tracking their participant reimbursements, and then the outcomes at the most core fundamental level. But what most of them are missing is that fiscal piece on how to tie program delivery with invoicing and all of that. And I've had some systems that states, they did a great first try and they gave it their all, and it's just not a fun system to work in at all.
There, baby.
Yeah, and but you got to work with what you got, and but none of them are insurmountable by any means. So my recommendation though is that you still would have your own system, because the bottom line is that the data is the state system. So anything you put in there, they own. And so that might become a challenge for you. You might have additional stuff that you don't need to put in that system.
Like PII and like very personal details about case management that you want to like leave out. Yeah.
Yep.
Very good.
So my recommendation is that you definitely do it in-house, and then you just facilitate that data transfer into the state system.
Yeah,
So you
yeah.
can kind of maintain that control because they are your participants, and they're also the state's participants because you are basically a subcontractor for the state, and you will have data sharing agreements and everything like that. But you want to be able to maintain some level of control over that.
And yeah, I will say most state systems were built with like decades ago, and it's really challenging to update them to like you're trying to fit like a square peg into a round hole. So you're trying to like make something work that it was never intended to do. And so what ends up happening is the workflows are clunky, the way that things have to be titled are weird and don't make sense, like as if SNAP E&T wasn't already like its own language, then you're also having to do that. Um, and some of them are much more sophisticated and require a lot more tracking than others. I actually helped Washington State try to redo their state system. And I will also say it's just updating those things is very, very, very slow. And the folks on the IT side, they're not on the program side. So like that level of understanding that I feel like is also a different language that everyone is speaking to. And so that's also one of the biggest issues that I see across the nation is that so like they're using a system that maybe was like initially designed for I don't know something
Medicaid or Medicare
yeah,
or something.
or yeah,
It's
something
like,
that's very
Yeah,
basic, right? And then you're trying to
it's
like
copy
put
and paste.
band-aids and band-aids on yeah. So
yeah.
it's always yeah, better to have your own system that you're then choosing what data goes into theirs. There are ways of customizing reports so that you can like have your system like create a report that includes like the case note and the update and blah 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 to then copy and paste into the state system. There are ways of doing that, and I've done it in Caseworthy specifically, which was wildly helpful in terms of data entry and saved a whole lot of time. So you know that we have some tips and tricks and things depending on what
Okay.
system you're using. But
Yeah.
yes, don't
I'm
give up.
just feeling the same thing with vocational rehabilitation, OVR here in Kentucky, and that, I mean, the forms that they want you to use are so obsolete
Oh yeah, yeah. So you
I
get
mean, it's
it.
just,
Yep.
it's a nightmare. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
how I always feel about when if anybody says anything, we owe it to me. I'm just like, ah,
Well,
pull my hair
that's
out because of the.
That's in our wheelhouse right now. That's we're looking at a system to kind of simplify and bring all this stuff together. So
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I
yeah,
reckon Salesforce has been pretty good, and I think there's an integration piece for grant management. There's some that I don't recommend. Maybe we can chat offline,
yeah.
but
No, that's,
yeah.
well,
You
thank you for that.
definitely, though, at the end of the day, you can tell whether or not the person who designed that system had any experience in program delivery,
Yeah,
who has to actually use this thing versus the person who just wants the data. And so,
back in my
my
education days, I was kind of on the committee that delivered the first electronic grading program across the
Whew.
state, and what
oh,
a nightmare. It's just like, anyways, uh, sorry. Thanks for your time there. Appreciate
Yeah,
it.
of course.
yeah, of course. No, thanks for the question. So, we talked about the non-personal pieces of what it takes to run a SNAP E&T program. So let's talk about the real important piece, and that's going to be the people, because this really is the backbone of your SNAP E&T operation. Not only because they are the people who are working directly with your participants, but they're also the ones who are going to be doing all the back end support to make sure that they're supporting your participants' journey through your SNAP E&T program, and that they're successful, and that you're able to capture all that information that the states are going to want to be able to see to celebrate the success of your program and of your participants. So we're going to talk about our frontline staff, your support staff, any administrative staff, and then again that all important fiscal staff, for being able to support your operation. So, Matt, when you're talking about the personnel infrastructure capacity, you want to first take your SNAP E&T functions and map that to your staff who are going to perform those operations. So you really want to have a solid understanding of what are the various SNAP E&T functions that you are going to need to execute on. And then start thinking about, well, who do I already have in my organization? What are they doing, and where do these functions most closely align to what those existing roles are? Because most likely, if you already are running a program, you have most of these people already in place. So it's really about just taking maybe this one little additional piece on doing that SNAP E&T benefit check or submitting that reverse referral, and who's going to do that, who's going to be documenting any support service needs and issuing those disbursements to that participant for those support service needs. On the data entry piece, when there is that external system where you need to enter that data into that external system for the state, well, who's going to do that? At CEO, we have, since we have so many locations, we actually, for us, we have an entire department. It was actually the department that I managed before I came into this role, and that's all that we did was focused on data and reporting for all of our various grants. So who do you have in your organization that would be the expert that would make the most sense to do that? Once you've identified all those functions and you've assessed whether or not you have staff in your current organization to be able to handle those things, you're going to be able to assess whether or not you have any gaps. And it might be because that you have the capacity as far as the staffing, but maybe they don't have the knowledge or expertise that they need to be able to execute on those tasks. And then it just becomes maybe like a training to get them up to speed on what they need to do to execute that. Maybe you don't have anybody currently able to do these tasks, and maybe you're already maxed out on capacity, and so that you need to kind of figure out how do you troubleshoot that. Do you need to hire an additional person to fill that gap, or are there other things that you can do to assess how to fill those gaps? But it's about connecting the work that has to happen to run a SNAP E&T program, connecting that with that person, and then how do you monitor to make sure that those things are happening. So it's not just about just having enough people. Like I said, you need to make sure that one, like for all the functions that are related to SNAP E&T, and again, the great thing is that if you are already running a program, these functions are more than likely already happening because they're kind of boilerplate for so many other types of employment and training programs. Or if you've had funding from other grant sources, a lot of them have very, very similar expectations. So a lot of things are probably already going to be occurring in your organization, but you still need to be able to identify, who's going to be the owner of that function and who you're going to assign that function to, making sure that they understand the requirements of that function and that they're well prepared so that when you're ready to begin executing on your SNAP E&T on day one, that you're ready to go and everybody kind of knows what they're supposed to be doing. You want to make sure that they're available to be able to work the task that you're going to assign to them. And do they have the capacity, given the volume that you're going to expect that you're going to be running through the program? Or are they going to have that capacity to be able to actually do the task? And then, do you need to have a backup assigned? Who's going to supervise those people to make sure that things are happening when they're supposed to happen? We're all human, things get forgotten. And so you want to know who's going to oversee those tasks and kind of supervise to make sure that they're happening. And backups can be a big important piece too, because if you never know what's going to happen, and if that person's not going to be gone tomorrow, if they're going to be gone tomorrow, you want to make sure that you have a clear backup plan in place to make sure that your participants are able to continue to be served and you're able to continue to run your SNAP E&T program without there being any kind of huge delay or hiccup there. States want to be able to know that you're able to continue to run through unforeseen circumstances that might be occurring. So again, you want to start with the functions, not necessarily job titles that you have. And so we have a great mapping tool that you can utilize to help identify all the various SNAP E&T functions. But the first thing is to identify what those functions are and need to understand what the purpose of that function is and how it needs to work. Once you understand that function, the next thing is going to be to try to see if you already have somebody in your organization that will be able to take on that function, and where does that most make sense in your program model with the way that your program operates. A prime example is like some programs have a very linear path in the way that the program model operates, and they even have specific roles that, from your intake to the program delivery to the data reporting to the fiscal and the outcome reporting, and it's just very clear. Some of these models, like it's the one person does a lot of this kind of stuff. Once that participant comes in the door, they get assigned that case manager, and the case manager is doing a lot of those tasks, and so they stay with that one person the entire time. So it depends on what works best for your program and what makes the most sense. But then, once you do assign those functions to people, then you just want to make sure that everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing, so that when you are ready to actually execute on your SNAP E&T plan, that you know what the requirements are, and that people are ready to go. And that's not to say that you're going to get it all right the first time around. And I don't think that anybody, including your state partners, are going to have those expectations, that there aren't going to be hiccups along the way. It is generally viewed as a partnership, and your state partner is looking to work with you and iron out those things, with the ultimate goal of, when it comes to a time that you have an evaluation, that you have a solid program and that everything's running the way it will, the way it's supposed to. And then finally, just when you're identifying what those processes are and you're assigning these roles, identifying those gaps, and then and plugging them and figuring out how you need to correct them. So those core functions that you want to be able to assign, are having to do, again, with that participant flow. Like, what are the things that have to happen when that participant comes to you? That referral, the reverse referral process, that intake and eligibility process for when you first get that participant in the door, and the information that you want to capture, and how do you do that assessment to make sure that they're a good fit for your program. So you want to make sure that you are assigning those tasks. These are things that SNAP E&T is going to expect as well. They want to make sure that, before you enroll somebody into the program, that you've assessed them to make sure that they're a good fit and that they can complete the program and be successful. And if there are certain barriers, to make sure that you're able to address them so that they can complete that program. But otherwise, if you assess somebody and they find that this person is not a good fit, or this person is not going to be able to complete the program because they have a barrier that they cannot overcome, well, their expectation would be that you don't enroll them into the program. But so you need to have those staff members up front to be able to perform those assessments, and making sure that the people that you're bringing into the program are able to complete it successfully, so that they get that outcome that we're desiring. Then you have the people who are actually doing the service delivery. So the people who are actually doing the training, the people who are actually doing the case management and doing those supportive service assessments to make sure that any barriers are being able to be removed. Who's going to take on those roles? And then with that comes the documentation. Are those same people going to be responsible for doing the documentation and doing the case notes? Oftentimes they are. Who's going to handle the attendance and the participation records? Are those captured electronically? And then how are those going to get transferred to the state? Are you going to have a separate person for those? Or again, that's going to be a dedicated person who's also dealing with your participants. And then your participant file maintenance. At the end of the day, you're going to have a participant case file, whether that's electronic or whether it's a physical file in a folder. But who's going to be responsible for maintaining those? Because at any given point in time, you might need to pull that file, and somebody might want to, from the state, might want to inspect that. So you want to make sure that you have a good process and a person in charge of being responsible for that. And then finally, that fiscal and data and the oversight, the data reporting, making sure that you have the proper fiscal backup. And a big piece too is like, how are you overseeing? Who's going to have oversight responsibilities over your program? To make sure that all of the pieces that go together to make this an effective program, who has oversight? Is that going to be your program manager, or is it the director? Whoever that might be, will be responsible for that. So we're going to test, part of that, doing that assessment is, you're going to figure out who the owner is going to be. So who's responsible? Do they have the authority to make decisions? Do they have the capacity? Do they have the know-how and the knowledge they need to execute that? And then is there that backup? If all of those are a yes, then great. You map that to that person, you do the training, and then you're able to execute on that. If not, then you log out a gap, and then that's going to be an area that you just need to assess to make sure that that you are able to figure out how to fill that gap. And that's where I definitely would suggest getting with your technical assistance person if you identify a gap, so that you can try to maybe troubleshoot how some things on how you could go through that. So there's just some common mapping gaps. You don't have a function assigned, the knowledge isn't there, the oversight's not there. Maybe you have a capacity issue where you don't have a person available to that. They have all the things that they need to do, but they just don't have the ability to do it because they have too much work on their plate. So these are things that you want to be able to make sure you identify. And again, if there's a gap, you want to try to figure out how you can address those. And so the final thing is just, I want to just show you too, it's going to be a brief overview. So SGI has developed this staff mapping tool. It's going to be included in this slide deck, but essentially, again, it's going to give you those functions of SNAP E&T, and then your goal is going to be to take those functions and then map them to your staff, who you believe are going to be able to do those functions. And then if you have those gaps, then you document that you identify that is a gap. So that's an area of opportunity for you to continue working on to kind of fill that gap. So that will be included in the session, and then also working with your technical assistance liaison on to work through those. But it's a cool little tool, and but yeah, that's all I've got on that. And then for the sake of time, Sam, we can just kind of punch through these last three, but we'll leave these for everybody in the to review. But it's basically showing how we take 3 different program support staff roles and who the people are, and how you would potentially map those to functions, just so you can see how that mapping tool works and how you would assign people to do certain things, and how it aligns with their role already. So. Any questions? I know that was an awful lot.
Right at time.
Right at time. So, Sam, I will pass it to you because I know you have just a couple last minute things to discuss on our up next